Okay. Okay, I'd like to begin, please. You may notice that I'm entirely on my own today. That's because Miranda and Christina are unwell, and Derek has just left the building. No, he'll be right back. So it's myself and Derek will be lecturing to you today. I'll be doing the first half of the lecture. If we could start, that would be good, because we're really pressed for time today. Okay, so I'm going to do the first half of the lecture, and I'm going to talk almost exclusively about Heart of Darkness, and Derek is going to, after the break, which might be a little bit earlier than usual, depending on how we do for time, he's going to talk about the film Apocalypse Now and its connection to this very well-known novel/novella. Technically, it's a novella, which is just another way of saying a short novel, and that's as far as my expertise on that particular matter goes. We have here essay topics on Conrad, and we don't generally give these out until either the end or at the break, and that makes sure that you have a strong incentive for sticking around. Not that the quality of the lecture isn't incentive enough for all of us. This is a very controversial novel. I will spend some time talking about that, but I don't want to spend a ton of time on that. Suffice it to say that one of the questions that will arise today is whether or not we should even be reading it. And as you'll see, there's one author who will be reading for next week who thinks we shouldn't. Obviously, I don't agree with him, or we wouldn't be reading the text. So we need to talk to some extent about that quite early on. Now, I've been haranguing my students this year about essay titles, and I've been thinking a lot about titles lately, and I abandoned the original title for this lecture, which was White Skins, Black Masks. White Skin, Black Masks. I decided to abandon that title, even though I liked it and had become very fond of it, because I don't regard race as the crucial issue in this text, and to do so would be to yield to some of the arguments that we're going to look at in a second. So I decided to abandon that title, and I've come up with this very pedestrian one instead. What or where is the heart of darkness? It's a deceptively simple question because it's not so sure. I mean, it wouldn't be unusual to read this book and come to the conclusion that you're not entirely sure what's going on. Right? There's a lot of emphasis on the mysteriousness of the heart of darkness, on inscrutability, on meaning, on language, or whether or not Marlowe can even tell us what the heart of darkness is, or if he even knows what the heart of darkness is. And of course, the most famous two words in this novella are, of course, or is, of course, one word repeated, and that word, of course, is the horror. Two words, the horror, the horror. And many, many essays have attempted to explain what that is. You can buy some of them online. Don't do that. Many, many essays have dealt with this particular issue. So I'm not promising you certainty today. I'm not promising to unlock the mystery for you. I'm just going to try to convey as clearly as possible in the half of the lecture that I have what it is that Conrad appears to be up to. I'm not a huge believer in the importance of biography in Arts 1. I think it's important to know something about an author, but I don't think we have to know a lot about an author to understand or not understand, whatever the case may be, what's going on in a text. Arts 1 is not biography, but we should say a little bit about Conrad, and I've said very little about Conrad, and there's what we need to know about him. If you're interested in learning more, of course, your text has a chronology of his life and has some comments about that as well. You almost certainly know that Conrad is considered one of England's most famous authors, but he wasn't English, at least not originally. And you may also know that Conrad's face appears on the cover of the Norton Anthology of English Literature Major Authors Edition. If you make the cover of that text, you have been officially embraced by the canon. If you don't know what a canon is, with C-A-N-O-N, we don't really have the time to deal with that today. Suffice it to say that you've been accepted as a kind of official, heavy-hitting member of some very exclusive literary club. And we'll have, I'll have a few more things to say about the canon in a second. Conrad achieves that distinction despite the reality that English is not his first language. English is not even his second language. His first language was Polish, his second language French, his third language English. And he learned his English in the British British Merchant Navy is what I'm trying to say. That's where he learned his English. And yet he manages to rise to the distinction of a very famous English author, and later in his life he becomes a naturalized English subject. So the key thing that we want to know is that he finished Heart of Darkness in 1899, and of course he dies in the 20th century. His Heart of Darkness, I'm told, or at least I've read, is the most widely read piece of 20th century fiction taught in North America. And this is probably why Achebe is at least partly why he's so upset with Conrad, as we'll see in a second. It's a very well-read novel. It's considered a work of 20th century fiction, but in many ways it's Victorian. Conrad, of course, the bulk of his life is in the Victorian age, and a lot of his attitudes toward a lot of different things could be called Victorian, and that would include his very questionable language and attitudes toward race, and we'll discuss that, as I said, very shortly. We've recently read somebody who's got race very much on their mind and is relevant to today's discussion. So it would be strange not to mention him. That, of course, is Fanon, who claims that the Negro is not any more than the white man, by which I take him to mean that racial identity is historically constructed and not a kind of biologically innate thing. That race is constructed socially, historically. Now, one of the things I did when I took Arts 1 many years ago is I had to take electives like you guys do. And one of the electives I took was an anthropology course where I learned that race is not a biological construction when it comes to human beings, but a social one. And we talk as if sometimes we talk as if it's biological. I wonder where Conrad stands on this. I don't really have an answer. You might at times come to the conclusion that Conrad regards blacks as not human. That would be an unfair and I think untenable conclusion, because he says many times that they are human. Is he politically correct? No. Is anybody in Conrad's generation politically correct? I think we need to understand that and accept that Conrad is very much a product of his times. But he certainly appears, and I would certainly strongly make the case for the claim that Conrad regards everybody in this story as human. But he does see a significant number of people who behave inhumanely, and they're almost invariably white and European. Anyway, just leave that one hanging for you. I wanted to show you that there's a connection to Fanon here. I don't, as I said to you at the beginning of the lecture, I don't want to dwell on race today, but it's become impossible not to at least acknowledge it as an issue and talk about it. And we have to, I would argue that there's a distinction to be made between Conrad pre-post-colonialism, Conrad post-post-colonialism. In some ways, Conrad himself might be a kind of post-colonial author, by which I mean he's very critical of colonialism. I think we can see that. And I think even some of his harshest critics acknowledge that much, that Conrad is no fan of colonialism, although it's suggested that he's more fond of British colonialism than other forms. Is there evidence in the novella that would support that? And what is the evidence?
He talks about how pleased he is to see all.
Yes, when we see a map of Europe and we're told in our footnotes that it's coded by color and that anything red is British and French is blue, and I think Portuguese is orange, and Belgian is yellow, which is interesting because Conrad is also, not Conrad, Marlowe is also described as yellowish, and of course he's tainted by his associations. You have a question? Yes, and can we just leave that hanging, because I do want to talk about his this sort of satirical tone. You know, I ventured to hint that the company was run for profit. When he says stuff like that, he's being satirical for sure, or at least ironic. So even that, as you suggest, Linnae, even that could be questionable. But you're absolutely right that it's set up in ways that we could read it as saying that British colonialism is superior to the jolly Germans and their jolly lager beer and so on. He makes those distinctions. We might also say that if Conrad is a racist, he's more anti-Belgian than anything else. I mean, he says some very negative things about the Belgians, which reminds me of a very funny Monty Python skit, but I will restrain myself. So we've got a text here that read prior to the advent or the increased interest of post-colonial studies, which of course was going to depend upon post-colonization. So when the colonial states begin to break up, and really sort of toward the middle part of the 20th century, this becomes an increasing way of studying them. And we said that when we looked at The Tempest, for example, we could read it as pre-post-colonial and post-colonial. And the same thing is true of Conrad. Now, prior to this increasing preoccupation with race and colonialism, it wouldn't be unusual to take a symbolic reading of the text, to look at the mythological aspects of the text, to see the darkness as somehow psychological, whether Freudian or Jungian, some kind of suppressed urges or unlawful desires. And we have a lot of that material here. We're told at the very beginning of the novel that as he floats on the River Thames, waiting for the tide to turn, Marlowe tells the listeners that this too has been a place of darkness, suggesting that modern Europeans, sitting in the very cradle of modern civilization, London, that even here beneath the surface beats a kind of heart of darkness. A lot of emphasis on this notion of surface. What is lurking beneath the surface? We're never really entirely clear on what it is. So the heart of darkness, on one level, like the Tempest, allegorical. It's an allegorical text. It seems to be allegorical. We're not going to literally understand what the darkness is, although there are people that are literally dark and people that are literally white, and there's a continent that's described as dark, and so on and so forth. And Conrad is doing quite interesting things, I think, with color. In fact, I think he's subverting them, as I'll suggest in a few minutes. What I want to suggest that Conrad's most interested in is the paradox of progress. The way in which modern progress, much celebrated, of course, during the period of the French Enlightenment, can in fact be a double-edged sword. It's something that cuts in two directions. It can give us wonderful things. It can give us very bad things. I don't want to say too much about this now because I want to sort of build my way up to it, but I would suggest it's his major theme. His major theme is that there's something paradoxical about progress. And this is connected to the word modernism. And if you do any reading at all on Conrad, and I'm a political scientist, not an expert on literary criticism, but I'm certainly familiar with the word modernism. It's a word you can't escape when you talk about Conrad. He's described as a modernist writer. At a minimum, I want you to have some sense today when you leave here of what that means and how that works its way out in Conrad's writing and how it's connected to the issue of progress, because I think modernism, or the modernist literature, which is more than a literary movement, it also involves political thinking, is connected to what Conrad's purposes are. And I think his major emphasis in this text is in looking critically at the idea of progress. Right? And we've encountered another writer this year who's spoken a lot of that and is all over that concept. Of course, his name is Rousseau. So it won't be entirely unfamiliar to you to think that somebody could be a modern writer, in the case of Rousseau, standing right in the middle of the Enlightenment and have negative things to say about progress. And so to return to Linnaeus' comment a second ago, when we see phrases like the noble cause, I think we need to read them ironically. If we're not reading them ironically, we're not getting Conrad. Conrad is, I think, quite clearly being ironic when he says the noble cause. So he wants to look at the hypocrisies of imperialism, but he wants to go deeper than that. I don't think this is just Conrad saying, I really don't like what I'm seeing, because Conrad himself traveled up the Congo River, and Conrad saw a lot of very bad things. He saw people being beaten. He saw people dying, no doubt, and this obviously had a kind of an impact on him. And I think he's indignant about it. I think he's genuinely turned off by what he calls the vilest scramble for loot that has ever scarred, humankind. That's a paraphrase. But by the same token, I think he wants to go beyond that. He wants to say something about the human condition itself, and which connects everybody of all races, I think, and transcends some of the more seemingly narrower aspects of the text. But again, really beginning in earnest with the post-colonial literature of the 50s and 60s, Conrad has come increasingly under suspicion. And it's because of a lecture delivered by Chinua Achebe, who we're reading for next week, whose book, Things Fall Apart, is also on our reading list. It's now, I think, almost impossible to think of Conrad without raising the issue of race. In fact, we might ask ourselves if we should even be reading The Heart of Darkness. Are we engaged in something questionable, even picking this book up and beginning to read it? As I said to you earlier, it's a very widely read book. It's not only a part of the canon. Some critics have called it hyper-canonized, meaning it's almost always there in the canon. It's almost always something that we read. And yet, Achebe describes Conrad as a quote-unquote bloody racist. Should we, as Arts 1 students, be reading this text? That's a question you'll have to ask yourselves. If you refuse to read it, if you're a conscientious objector, you need to tell me now. Otherwise, we're going to assume that you've read the text. We've obviously resolved that we should teach it because it's on our reading list. Achebe's an author in his own right. He's not from the Congo. He's Nigerian. In 1975 at the University of Massachusetts, he delivered a lecture on Conrad, or on a variety of themes, but in that lecture he called Conrad a racist. And to be a little more concrete, he said that in Conrad, Africa is a foil to Europe, a place of negations, in comparison with which Europe's own state of spiritual grace will be made manifest. Again, this is J.B.'s reading. I don't know if it may or may not resonate with your reading. You may have read the text differently. You may not have seen a state of spiritual grace in Conrad's bitingly acerbic and satirical comments about Europe. You can see where I stand on this. I don't agree with Achebe. Achebe says that the very humanity of black people is called into question in this text. I don't think that's true, but that's Achebe's opinion. I think if you read the text carefully, you probably wouldn't come to that conclusion, but I can't prejudge how you're going to read the text. And then he says this, and this is hard to dispute. Conrad certainly had a problem with niggers. His inordinate love of that word itself should be of interest to psychoanalysis. Now, it's hard not to agree, at least at first blush. It's hard not to look at this and go, yeah, I was really uncomfortable with the use of the N-word throughout this text. In fact, the title of one of Conrad's novels is called The Nigger of the Narcissus. So it's a word he's using, and he's using a lot. Is he using it gratuitously? Is he using it pejoratively? Well, I don't think Achebe has bothered to try to show us one way or the other, but he's certainly taken by the reality that Conrad uses that term a lot. And there's no doubt that he does. I don't know what that in and of itself demonstrates, because I've put this together for you. It's very unscientific, and it's not completely full. Hang on, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. And he also says that we shouldn't read it, that Conrad's book should be removed from the canon. I don't know who makes such decisions. I mean, is there a canonical tribunal out there that decides what does and doesn't count, or should or shouldn't be read? If we begin to go down that road, where do we draw the line? You know, Shakespeare's anti-Semitic comments in many of his plays, The Merchant of Venice springs to mind. Should we remove him as well? Should we stop reading books that we find offensive by today's standards? Well, Achebe is comfortable saying that we should. He's, won't surprise you to learn that many have disagreed with him on this, but not everybody disagrees with him, as we'll see in a second. Anyway, we need some context here. And what I've done is a very unscientific thing. I've come up with, I've gone through a number of texts looking for the N-word, and this is what I've come up with, and this is very partial. This is very partial. And the N-word appears in all of the following texts, and sometimes pretty extensively. And I'm not going to bother reading them out to you, but just draw your attention to a few of them. James Joyce, part of the canon. Nobody's ever suggested he should be removed from the canon because of his very pejorative use of the N-word in Ulysses. Right? You'll see that Dickens uses the M-word in at least 2 works, that Henry Miller uses it in Tropic of Cancer, that Ralph Ellison uses it in The Invisible Man. Now, some of these authors are black, and it may be that they have, legitimate reasons or excusable reasons for using the term. But as you'll see, not all of them are black, and many of these authors are part of, or at least considered to be part of the so-called canon. So Dostoevsky uses the term in Crime and Punishment, something that surprised me, and I didn't remember at the time, but I went back and verified that it's true. Now, what about other stuff? Well, John Lennon uses the word in a 1972 song that he wrote with Yoko Ono called Woman is the Nigger of the World. Okay, so John Lennon, I'm wearing a John Lennon shirt, by the way. I hope you noticed that. Elvis Costello, Oliver's Army, uses the term. And did you notice the use of the term in a movie that you just saw recently called Shaun of the Dead? How many of you noticed that that word appeared in the movie? Only one of you. Who uses it, do you recall? Ed. Yeah, he uses the term. So it's not as if the term, it's not as if Conrad has something really special and incredibly unusual, that Conrad has used the word. Right? And of course, we're not even going to talk about hip-hop and rap and the use of the word and its peculiar spelling. That's a whole other debate. But I'm focusing obviously here on writers and works of art that might be considered comparable to Conrad. And so in that sense, as a late Victorian, early 20th century writer, it's not that unusual when you contextualize it that Conrad has used the word so extensively. Okay, enough said about that. Now what about Said? What about Said and what he had to say? Well, Edward Said, recently deceased professor of English Comparative Literature at Columbia University, a major Palestinian-born American intellectual, a major figure in the post-colonial literature movement, very well known in political science circles, or at least some political science circles. And he has some stuff to say about Conrad as well. In short, he in some ways it goes even further than Achebe, but goes in a slightly different direction. He acknowledges that Conrad is a critic of colonialism, but says the following, that his tragic limitation, you see Conrad had this tragic limitation, is that even though he could see clearly that on one level imperialism was essentially pure dominance and land grabbing, he could not then conclude that imperialism had to end so that natives could lead lives free from European domination. He could not grant the natives their freedom. Now, you can try to write that down, but I don't know that that's a good idea. I mean, I can make these slides available to you if you want these citations. Now, there's a counter-argument to this. It's a guy named David Denby. He's a very well-known writer for a very well-known and very reputable publication called The New Yorker. And he was a student in Columbia's Great Books course. It's kind of Columbia University in New York. It's its version of Arts One. It's almost as good as Arts One. It's a actually very famous program. And he's written a book simply called Great Books, in which he has an essay on many of the writers we've read this year, including Conrad. And he says this about Achebe. He called his 1975 speech an act of rhetorical violence. And that's almost all he says about it. In other words, he doesn't think we need to be too bothered engaging with this, that once we start involving ourselves in debates about whether or not we should be reading books, and we're going down a slippery slope, and Denby doesn't want to see us go down that road. Of Said, he says, blaming writers for what they fail to write about is bizarrely wrong-headed or even malicious. Right? I mean, to blame Conrad in 1899 for not going beyond what he does in the text is just wrong-headed and strange, says Denby, and I tend to agree with that. I mean, we're going to criticize him now for what he didn't do, not for what he did do. And you know, he is, after all, engaged in a piece of literature. This isn't an attempt to change the world, and maybe on some level all literature is. But you know, why is he obligated to go beyond what he does? In any case, who speaks for Conrad? Is it the narrator, the unnamed narrator? Is it Marlowe? Conrad has, as you know from reading the text and the preview material, Conrad has quite a complicated relationship with Marlowe. Claims not to know him all that well. Yeah.
Well, I think, like Said's point, all the obligation on the person who writes, instead of having a kind of spread out responsibility that perhaps someone else might have written about what Conrad left out. Instead, because Conrad has produced something. I think that's like.
Are you agreeing with Said, or are you questioning? Yeah, I'm just a little unclear. Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you for the clarification. Thanks. Well, then I have a question for us to think. It's kind of a quasi-rhetorical question. I sort of have an answer. If not Conrad, who? I mean, who in 1899 is writing about the Heart of Darkness? Who in 1899 is writing about what's going on in the Belgian Congo? Now, I don't have enough time to go into detail on this, and it wouldn't be fair to Derek to do so because it would be eating into his lecture time. But suffice it to say that Conrad, you know, he's talking about something that really happened. Obviously, it's fictionalized. He really was in the Congo, and in the late 1800s, King Leopold II of Belgium decided that he wanted to have his own colony. Now, this is the Coles Notes, very heavily cribbed version of the story, and it's going to be kind of glib. He decided he wanted his own colony. And so he, without ever setting foot in Africa, without ever setting foot there, and there's something very modern about that. You think of the bomber that sits up in the stratosphere and watches as the bomb hits Hiroshima. He's not there watching people die. The person that sends the remote-guided missile isn't there when the missile explodes, right? So there's something quite modern about that remoteness, that a dictator can sign a piece of paper and millions of people could die, right? And really, Leopold becomes he's a maniac for sure, who wants to satisfy his own ego, never harms a single person directly himself, but he sets up this company, this so-called benevolent society, to run his own colonial possession. It's so bad that even other colonialists are upset with him, and there's eventually an international tribunal strips him of his colony and hands it over to the Belgian government. At the turn of the previous century, actually at the turn of the previous century, I have to get used to saying that, at the end of the 1800s, somewhere in the neighborhood of 9 million people had already died as a direct result of Leopold's activities. That's called a genocide. And who was chronicling that? Well, Conrad and others. You know, if you go back and look at the newspapers of the time, it does begin to emerge as a major issue. But it's not something that everybody knows about, as we'll see. So if not Conrad, then who was going to tell this story? Now, this is a quotation from a guy named Adam Hochschild, who's written a book called, what is it called? It's about King Leopold, King Leopold's Ghost. And a lot of the material in our text is actually taken from that book, King Leopold's Ghost, including some of those really horrific and graphic pictures that you have at the end. He says the Victorian age was a golden age of letters and diaries, and it has often seemed as if every visitor or official in the Congo kept a voluminous journal. One problem, of course, is that nearly all of this vast river of words, I'm not sure whether vast river is a deliberate pun on Heart of Darkness, is by Europeans or Americans. There was no written language in the Congo when the Europeans first arrived, and this inevitably skewed the way that history was recorded. Instead of African voices from this time, there is largely silence. So, okay, it's not as if the white voice of Conrad has suppressed and marginalized African voices. There were no other voices. That's the point that Hochschild is making. That nobody was, it's not quite true that nobody was speaking, but in terms of a well-known literary work, Conrad stands alone. Now, if you think of the political impact of this, Hochschild says, I knew nothing. I knew almost nothing about the history of the Congo until a few years ago. This is 1998. Then it occurred to me that, like millions of other people, I had read something about that time and place after all, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. However, with my college lecture notes on the novel filled with scribbles about Freudian overtones, mythic echoes, and inward vision, I had mentally filed away the book under fiction, not fact. So, you know, here's a text that has a real-life connection to something that really happened. The first really industrial-scale genocide of the early 20th century. And it hasn't ended. The Democratic Republic of Congo, as it's known today, euphemistically, because it's not democratic, not really even a republic, it's still classified, at least the eastern part of it, is still classified as a zone of conflict, where really terrible things are going on. Again, I've had to delete those slides because I don't have time to go through. Suffice it to say that it remains a place, I don't know if I want to say a place of darkness, because that might be taking this allegory too literally. It certainly remains a particularly bad place, as we'll see in a few seconds. I've got a slide on that. And then we've got this guy named Jonathan. I don't know who Jonathan is. This is the magic of the internet. It can empower anybody, anytime, to say anything. So Jonathan, I've taken you, Jonathan, whoever you are, and I've cut and I've pasted you into my lecture. And Jonathan says, I watched the video on the Congo Free State in English class and was appalled at the gory details of torture and the use of fear to break the Congo people. No, this video wasn't shown randomly. I hate that word, but anyway. We just read The Heart of Darkness, a book that depicts the journey of one dude named Marlowe, his journey up a nameless river in Africa, all the while seeing the horrors of the European occupation. So why is it that I learned about King Leopold in an English class and not in world history or political science? Right? The situation reminded me of a scene in Hotel Rwanda when some guy from the UN was telling Don Cheadle, the main character, that the UN was pulling out and wasn't going to stop the mass killing. He said something along the lines of, the world doesn't care about you. In their eyes, you're nothing. Not an exact quote, thank you. Is the lack of information in textbooks about the exploitation of the Congo proof of that? He's onto something legitimate here, right? I mean, it's not quite as polished as what Hochschild says, but what Jonathan says, if that's his real name, is every bit as legitimate and I think interesting and compelling. So this is about all I'm going to say about the Congo, is there it is. And obviously I've cut out the rest of the countries around it so you can see its peculiar shape. That little bit, I wish I had a laser pointer here, I don't. That little bit that sticks out is actually about 30 miles of coastline. And of course, there is the mouth, you can almost see it actually, is the mouth of the Congo River, which winds its way into the heart of the Congo. It's roughly 3,000 miles long when it gets to its source. And it resembles, says Conrad and others, it resembles a snake. Right? It's a very powerful river. It's the second largest river in the world by volume. And, of course, metaphorically powerful, allegorically powerful. Real people, real Europeans have tried to get up that river and failed, and others have succeeded. And it's a sort of core part of the story. As I said before, I really can't go into the history of the Congo. Suffice it to say, it's gone through various stages. In the 1960s, it was known as, at one point it was known as Zaire up until 1997. There was an assassination of the then ruler, Laurent Kabila, in 1997. The country is now ruled by somebody named Joseph Kabila. It's gone back to being the Congo. It's now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in its eastern part, that is to say the bit over there, that borders on a number of countries, including Rwanda, most of the killing is now taking place. And the killing that is going on is being organized by gangs, by criminals. The state is more or less absent in the eastern part of the Congo. And of course, where the state is absent, where nobody's going to move in there, right, except multinational corporations. In many parts of this place, this world, these zones of conflict, where there are no institutional presences except multinational corporations, 85 of whom had their wrists slapped in 2002 UN report that said they shouldn't be doing business with these criminals. But it's very tempting for these multis to go there because they're not after rubber and ivory anymore. They're now after cobalt and gold, and they're after diamonds and other minerals as well. And many of these multinational corporations are, you guessed it, Belgian. And so in some ways it continues. And the killing continues. And it's now considered one of the worst zones of conflict in the world. And we're talking about the deaths of millions and millions of people. And it's not unusual for rape to be used as an instrument of conflict. Some of that conflict is indigenous. Some of that conflict is internal to the Democratic Republic of Congo itself. A lot of it has spilled over into its borders from neighboring countries, especially Rwanda in the early 1990s, when the Rwandan Civil War spilled into there when Hutu militias chased Tutsis into neighboring states. So it's not entirely an indigenous problem, but it's certainly a war-torn state. And so if Conrad was lamenting the plight of the Congo in 1899, he would lament it, I think, just as much today. That's really all I have time for in terms of contemporary politics. Now I ask another quasi-rhetorical question, but is the Congo even the heart of darkness that Conrad has in mind? In other words, is this, I mean, obviously on one level it's about the Congo, but is it ultimately about the Congo? And if it isn't ultimately about the Congo, might this take some of the sting out of the criticisms leveled particularly by Achebe? Is it not the case, or might it not be the case, that the Congo is merely the setting for Conrad's exploration of the paradox of human progress, if that's what this novel is? Just as the Vietnamese setting of Apocalypse Now may or may not be about Vietnam. We wait to find out, right? But in terms of the heart of darkness, I would suggest that it's just the setting. It's a particularly compelling setting. And, obviously there's, it can at times be in danger of becoming racialized, and it is racialized. But is it ultimately really just a setting that Conrad wants to use to talk about what he regards as a kind of central paradox, this double-edged sword of modern progress, which I'll expand upon as we go? Well, for one thing, Conrad does not seem to approve of colonialism, British or otherwise, although we could say that he's easier on the British than others. That's not surprising, given his aspiration to be English. And given that in his own life he was implicated, like Marlowe, in this stuff that he's criticizing, and I'll say more about that as well. But the novella, I have to keep reminding myself that it's not a novel and that it's a novella, this short novel, seems to subvert straightforward stories of colonial improvement, no doubt about that, in his exchange with his aunt, where he makes these ironic and acerbic comments about and these many comments about improvement, which have to be sort of read ironically. I think he sees that the light of civilization isn't so bright, and that the primitivism of the dark continent isn't so dark. In fact, I think he begins to subvert the imagery. And what I mean by that is that if you think of the Enlightenment, which we heard about in the context of Rousseau, the French Enlightenment, what does the word Enlightenment mean to you? Well, when it's got a capital E, it's referring to a specific, almost exclusively French period of intellectual history. But what does the word Enlightenment in its ordinary sense mean? I mean, I could push a button on this console and plunge us immediately into non-light. Right? It just means what? It means to light something up. Okay? So images of light and darkness are obviously being played with in Conrad, the way they're being played with in the magic flute. I don't know if you know Mozart's magic flute, but you've got the Queen of the Night, who represents darkness and unwisdom, and you've got Sarastro, who represents light and wisdom. From the French Enlightenment forward, don't we think of enlightenment meaning what? Intellectual awakening? Forget that I said the French Enlightenment forward. From Plato forward. Right? We want to get out of the cave of dark. We want to get out of the dark and into the light, and that means intellectual awakening and presumably some form of progress. Although we wonder how progressive Plato is, right? His own peculiar version of progress. But certainly from the Enlightenment forward, progress means a kind of moving forward in time and place, right? Things are getting better all the time. It's getting better all the time. Speaking of John Lennon, it's getting bad. Never mind. And that's the message to which Rousseau responds negatively. No, it's not getting better all the time. I sat under this tree on the road to Vincennes. I had this sudden enlightenment, and the enlightenment was it's not enlightenment, to put it ironically. I had this awakening, this epiphany, that the further we move toward the appearance of progress, the reality is we are regressing. We're becoming worse as a species. We're regressing, at least morally and ethically. I think Conrad's saying something similar. In fact, you see him beginning to subvert the imagery. Right, where London is called a brooding gloom in sunshine and a lurid glare under the stars. That doesn't sound too positive to me. As we're sitting on the Thames yesterday, looking toward the land and looking toward this monstrous city, this massive metropolis, the biggest city in the world for Conrad. And so he calls it a brooding gloom in sunshine. So we've got the natural light of the sun, but London is described as a brooding gloom. And under the stars, under the natural light of the stars, it's seen as a lurid glare, because the city is going to light up at night. But the light of the city at night is not put in positive terms. So it doesn't seem to be the same straightforward imagery that we're used to dealing with when it comes to light and dark. It's not enlightenment in the normal sense. He's literally talking about white and dark, but is he also subverting their meaning at the same time? So he's calling Africa a place of darkness. And we have many, many references to the impenetrability of the jungle. We have these incredible scenes where we're told that the ship is simply swallowed by the jungle. We have this caravan of buccaneers that goes off into the jungle, and Marlowe is delighted to learn that they've all died, or at least they seem to have died, because he regards them very negatively. These profiteers who have gone off into the jungle just swallows them up. So we have this sense that this is a place of natural darkness. It does have some racialized and unpleasant overtones. But at least does Conrad not say at one point, they wanted no excuse for being there. They lived there. This is their place. We are the intruders here. So the darkness is characterized as natural. We have this distinction between natural dark, natural light, and so on. We also have this sense that it might be the Europeans that are carrying darkness into Africa. We have the literal darkness, but we also have this figurative darkness, and that seems to be European. We have references to things like the germs of empire. The idea that disease is being carried into Africa, literally, figuratively, and of course many that are going into the heart of Africa are dying of disease. There's a lot of emphasis on illness in this text. Marlowe himself is malarial. That's why he appears to be yellow. It seems to be some kind of jaundice caused by his earlier trips. Conrad himself had malaria from traveling to the Congo. And there's a lot of emphasis on death. In fact, I tried to do a content analysis of the word death or words related to death, and it's astonishing. I mean, I gave up. There were so many references to death in this text, I just gave up looking for them. But one of the more interesting subversions of the white and the dark comes when Marlowe goes to Brussels, what he calls the sepulchral city. I don't know if you've ever been to Brussels. Marlowe doesn't like it. Conrad appears not to like it. Monty Python doesn't like it. Something sinister about Belgium. Well, in the novel, there's something sinister about Belgium. It's called and Brussels in particular is called the sepulchral city. And it's called the sepulchral city because it's white on the inside but dead on the inside. Sorry, white on the outside, dead on the inside. This comes through very clearly with the ladies that are knitting black wool. And it's a not so subtle allusion to hell, and they're the gatekeepers of hell. And they're sitting there knitting, doing something very ordinary activity, and Marlowe encounters them on the recommendation of his aunt. He's gone to see this important person to be brought into the company. He wants a job. He's relied on his aunt to get him that work. That has a real-life analog as well. It really was his aunt that found Conrad work in the Congo. But we have this notion of the term whited sepulchre. Have you encountered that phrase before? I think there's a footnote about it in the text. It's a reference to what? What is a whited sepulchre? Is your hand up? Or were you just sort of moving it? Yeah, it comes out of the New Testament, right? Well, it's an actual reference to, I think it's the book of Matthew. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not an expert. But It's a reference to the New Testament for sure, in which Jesus is said to have said to the scribes and Pharisees, "Woe unto ye, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites all." He said that a lot. You are like unto a whited sepulchre. Meaning, if you think of a tomb, what is a tomb? It contains death, it contains bones, it contains decay, but on the outside it's white and clean. White and clean on the outside, like Belgium, right? Like King Leopold and the face that he's presenting to the world. On the inside, housing death, hypocrisy. So interestingly, we've got this white, this notion of whiteness has now become a negative thing, right? So if we want to say that black is always racialized, well, if white is also racialized, then it's now become negative. Or it could just be that Conrad's using the terms white and black, notwithstanding his use of the N-word, to refer to his reversal of the normal imagery. So he's subverting our normal expectations, in other words. And sometimes it's more subtle than at others. But it's also the case, or we might also ask whether it's also the case, of whether or not the darkness has kind of moved inside. Now, this is a place where we might ordinarily, if we had lots of time, talk about, and if I were an expert in literary criticism, which I'm not, we might talk about the distinction between the realist novel and the modernist novel. But we've had some sense of what realism is in terms of novels. I think we could probably say that Austen is a realistic writer in the sense that she's got these characters who are real, and the world in which they move seems to be real, but it's limited. Her stories seem to be limited to a penetrating analysis of that world, but we don't really have much sense of what's going on inside those characters. Right? This is a very quick and dirty lecture in terms of its emphasis on realism versus modernism. I think we begin with Eliot to see what's going on inside these characters. Right? On the one hand, the world around them seems to be dominant. Right? I mean, we even have this note. We even have Maggie with her doll, her fetish, blaming everything bad that happens on the doll, and of course, Mr. Tulliver blaming everything that happens on Wakeham. But I think there is a sense in that novel that we're beginning to get a more kind of complicated sense of what human beings are. By the time we read Conrad, I think we've gotten there. So if you think about this distinction between the realist novel and the modernist fiction, reality, just at a minimum, to say something very minimal about modernism, reality is much more complicated than we seem to have thought it was in the past. That we may be describing characters, we may be describing things that are real in terms of the existing modes of production and so on, but are we capturing the full reality of human existence? And to do that, don't we need to get inside the head of characters and start to see what's going on there? Of course, we often associate terms like stream of consciousness with that. If you think of stream of consciousness, you usually think of a writer like Joyce. But Conrad does it too. In fact, how many of you noticed that in this novel, many times Marlowe lapses into a kind of stream of consciousness? Did you detect that? So Conrad uses those techniques as well. This is one of the, again, quick and dirty lecture on modernism versus realism. In 1882, Nietzsche has declared God dead. That's going to have an impact on everybody. Has an impact on literature. It has an impact on what we're calling the modernist work of literature, that all the old certainties of the past are now up for grabs. And it's putting human beings is making them a more central topic of writing and thinking and art. And of course, we've got these guys, Marx and Freud and Darwin, all doing their thing. How's that for quick and dirty? Revealing through their works and in their various ways that there may be things going on in our lives that we're not fully in control of. There may be these laws and structures, call them what you will, whether it's the materialist conception of history for Marx, or some internal subconscious innate impulses for Freud, or whether some law of the origin of species that's being driven along by. We don't have as much control of this world as we thought we once did. And there may be things in this world that are beyond our knowledge. Maybe this is one of the reasons why we can't say what the horror is, why we can't say what the heart of darkness is, because it could be beyond our knowledge. And if not beyond our knowledge, then beyond our ability to describe, or both. And I think we have a sense in the heart of darkness, through Marlowe's comments in particular, that might be the case. Modernism, again, is a very glib and sweeping history of what modernism is. When I think of modernist literature, when I think of T.S. Eliot and his Hollow Man, which is obviously dependent on Conrad, when I think of Waiting for Godot, a play in which nothing happens twice, I think of crisis. I think something's wrong. On the one hand, we think of the word modern as good. On the other hand, something not quite right here. The world has been disenchanted in some way. It's all Nietzsche's fault because he killed God off. He's left us standing there on our own. But on the other hand, we have this sense of new human possibilities, that we're now center stage. What ought we to do? Existence precedes essence and all that stuff, right? We're going to get out there and seize the moment and build a brave new world of our own. But we're also turning our back on something in the process. It's called community, civilization, the Platonic forms. All the things we thought we knew about the world are now gone. And that can be a scary place for some of us. Now, that's a very kind of sweeping characterization of what modernism is. I've got a few more things to say about it. But just in terms of where it sits temperamentally, if you read your Virginia Woolf, if you read your T.S. Eliot and other famous modernist writers, there's a sense of dislocation. Nowhere is this more powerful than T.S. Eliot. Right? The Wasteland in particular. Right? A very bleak and I don't know how to describe it, a very kind of despairing and depressing poem. Now, Eliot eventually figures it out and converts to Anglicanism and becomes a devout Christian, and all of his problems are gone. But the thing that's interesting in Eliot, and I'm being a little bit ironic there, the thing that's interesting in Eliot is the anxiety. You know, if you think of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, do I dare to eat a peach? I mean, this modernist stuff can be so earth-shatteringly anxiety-provoking that I can't even bring myself to eat a piece of Okanagan soft fruit. Do I dare to eat a peach? So maybe one of the implications of this modernism is, should we act? Do we act? On what basis do we act? We see times in the novel where Marlowe says, hang it all. Life's meaningless, I'm not going to do anything. Do you recall this? Right? This is part of this kind of modernist anxiety. To be or not to be, to act or not to act. At the end of the day, don't we have to do something with our lives? And that's one of the things that's being wrestled with, I think, in this text. And the source for this very, very, very sketchy and glib overview of modernism is Christina Howell's Encarta Online Encyclopedia. Don't like it, blame her. So we have no clear sense of direction in this world. We have no clear sense of direction in the modernist literature. It's characterized by experimentation, fragmentation, ambiguity. Life without any objective meaning or purpose. We could slip into the darkness. We could become nihilistic. We could become destructive. We could even justify doing it because at least it's interesting. So there's a world that has these dangers. I think Conrad sees that. He sees those dangers, and he's trying to allude to them, but he's also trying to sort of protect us from them at the same time. We see a world that's increasingly dominated by technology. Is that the answer? If we just become more and more technologically progressive, is this something that if we embrace this, is this going to make life better and more meaningful? The short answer is no. In 1944, we have the publication of one of the bleakest and most negative books ever written about modernity, called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. It was published by two German scholars that had fled Nazi Germany, and they set up something called the Frankfurt School of Social Research in a place called California. They had to get out of Germany, so they went to California. And this book by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer could be described as a full frontal assault on Western rationality, reason, and its belief in progress. The major reason being that we have this thing now called the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was a product of industrial technology. And in other words, nothing could be more glaringly evident that progress is a kind of double-edged sword than the idea that something like the Holocaust could be seen by Hitler as an industrial problem, quote, an industrial problem to be resolved by industrial means, unquote. Okay? In other words, when the Holocaust when the final solution was put into effect, those that organized it simply put things like gas ovens and the killing agent Zyklon B up for tender, and companies bid on that. And one of those companies was a company called IG Farben, which remained a German multinational corporation until about 15 years ago. And in the 1980s was still selling chemicals to the Libyan state. So old habits die hard. Sorry, you had something you wanted to say?
What was the title of the book?
Dialectic of Enlightenment. I think I have it in a slide, but if I try to go through all these slides, I'm going to run out of... There it is, right there. Genius, I just typed it in as you asked. So the application of reason doesn't always lead to progress, right? Wonderful things have come out of the splitting of the atom, right? Magnetic resonance imaging, nuclear medicine, all of those wonderful things that have made our lives better. The fight against cancer has been improved by these technologies. So has the ability to destroy our lives, to kill every human on this planet has now been made possible. So we're familiar, I think, with this idea of dual-use technologies. We're familiar with the skepticism of Rousseau. We're familiar that things that can make our lives better can also kill us. And then we have to turn to this issue of imperialism and genocide. Are these not also products of Western rationality? Are these not also made in Europe programs? Are these not also a kind of logical extension of that Enlightenment project? And are they not run, efficiently? Are they not run following reasonable principles? Are they not organized? And this is, I think, comes through in Conrad's Heart of Darkness if we read it carefully, that he anticipates and prefigures these problems. I think what Conrad is describing is a genocide, and it's made in Europe. Now, I have a few slides here about the absurd. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm going to have to power through this. Suffice it to say that the absurd, well, let's define it anyway. The absurd, according to Webster's dictionary, is that state or condition in which man exists in an irrational and meaningless universe. Sounds like my weekend. And in which man's life has no meaning outside his own existence, right? And this comes through powerfully enough, I think, in modernist literature, right? That what is the meaning of life? Are we alone in the universe? Do we have, think of existentialism, right? I mean, many have looked at Conrad and said this is an essentially existentialist view, because his emphasis on the absurdity of life. And look at the implications of this in our text. We've got Conrad, who tells only inconclusive stories. The narrator warns us that it's going to be another one of those kinds of stories from Marlowe. I'm going very quickly, and I'm sorry for that. One of the things I was struck with in this text is the extent to which a lot of these characters are not characters in the normal sense. Are you aware that there are only 3 proper names in this whole text? That only 3 characters have names: Marlowe, Fresleven, and Kurtz. Everybody else is described by what they do or what they are or how they function. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, etc. Now, I wonder if this isn't an homage to something called the Commedia dell'arte, a Renaissance form of comedy, satirical comedy, that became popularized, obviously, in the Renaissance, but had deep implications and elsewhere. It was a major Italian export. In fact, it was very influential on Shakespeare. If you think of The Mask, and in no play more so than The Tempest. What we have here is improvisational comedy, but we have a bare outline of a plot. We have a plot, and then people act out that plot. And there are stock characters in the process, and they wear masks, and I wonder if some of these characters aren't like that. As Marlowe is traveling down the coast of Africa on what seems like an endless journey to the Congo, he describes the events he's come to face, and he says that, he describes a whole litany of things that could be called absurd. And then he says that he feels like he's caught in some sordid farce acted out in front of a sinister black cloth. That this text is kind of farcical. That you've got these characters, but they're not really characters. The characterization isn't that strong. Even for Marlowe. We know very little about Marlowe himself. And you could say he, along with Kurtz, is the major character. Here you go. I mean, obviously, we don't have time to go through all of these, but look at the cast of characters. Look how they're described. The director, the lawyer, the accountant, the unnamed narrator. We've got the influential aunt. We've got the black wool knitters. We've got the Swede, the chief accountant, also known as a hairdresser's dummy. We've got the pilgrims, the manager, the first-class agent, also known as the papier-mâché Mephistopheles, and the brickmaker. Can you see where the Hollow Men found its inspiration? Do you know the first line of T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hollow Men? Mr. Kurtz, he dead. Okay, so he's referring straight to the Heart of Darkness. It's the sense that there's nothing going on inside these characters, that they are hollow men, right? We have Marlowe saying, I began to suspect that I could push my finger through this papier-mâché Mephistopheles. I began to suspect there was nothing going on inside some of these people. We have this Russian who's a harlequin. Well, that's interesting because one of the stock characters of the Commedia dell'arte is a harlequin. Looks like that. And because the harlequin is wearing these patched up clothes that make him resemble the harlequin. Then we have this other stock character called Pantalone, who's described as having a forked beard and a hooked nose, and is that not the brickmaker? I mean, it's exact. So whether or not this is on Conrad's mind, I don't know, but it certainly would work, because this would make, to rely on these stock characters would also be part of Conrad's modernism, by which I mean he's rejecting conventional characters. He's rejecting the conventional characterizations of realist literature, and he's taking us inside, but it turns out that there is no inside in many of these characters. They're just empty, but not all of them. Kurtz is not empty. And figuring out what makes Kurtz tick becomes an obsession for Marlowe. Marlowe is not empty. Right? And you'll notice that the characters that Marlowe admires are the ones that aren't hollow men. The ones that have something going on. No fool, says Marlowe, ever made a bargain with the devil, because he's too much of a fool. There's nothing interesting going on inside that person. But the people that have something interesting going on inside them can be dangerous because there are no constraints on their behavior, especially out there, says Marlowe, in the darkness. When you have time, and I was going to read from the text, we simply don't have time to do that. When you have time, read the passages that I've given you, read from the text, and you'll see that Conrad says some very interesting things about storytelling via Marlowe. I'm trying to tell you about a dream, right? The notion that there's somehow these stories are just fundamentally incommunicable, and that language is not up to the task of capturing reality, he says on page 97. This is all part of Conrad's connection to what we'd call modernism. A couple more minutes. One very famous critic said of The Heart of Darkness, or referred to Conrad's adjectival insistence upon inexpressible and incomprehensible mystery. In other words, he uses a lot of words that suggest that we don't know what's going on. Why the hell is he doing that? Because we don't know what's going on. Because life fundamentally evades full disclosure. So Marlowe says, I feel like I'm trying to tell you about a dream because I can't capture the full reality because I don't even know what it is. I don't know what the reality of Kurtz is. The reality is that we all have to face the darkness, act out this role, this comedy of errors, if you will, this sordid farce. But most of us manage to do that without becoming Kurtz, without yielding to the darkness, without becoming genocidal. So there's a sense in which we can escape it somehow. And let me give you some citations that suggest that. The earth for us is a place to live in, says Marlowe. We just have to muddle through. There's something very English about that. Conrad's picked that up from being naturalized as English. Right? Muddling through. We just get through life. Strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others, says Marlowe. There's nothing particularly profound about that. We live as we dream, alone. Sounds very Shakespearean. We make our own meaning. And what saves us ultimately is efficiency, dedication to our jobs, right? That's what saves us. There are many passages in the text that suggest that. We have the accountant and his obsession with accuracy. Why? You're in the middle of the jungle. People are dying around. Somebody is literally dying beside you as you're bookkeeping. No, the books have to be accurate, and I must keep up my appearance and my starched collars. So this notion of efficiency becomes a source of meaning for many of us. We have this book about nautical history that Marlowe says is not a very enthralling book, but at the first glance you could see there a singleness of intention and honest concern for the right way of going to work. And then we have Marlowe talking about his girlfriend, also known as the ship. And he talks about how she wrung under his feet and how he came to love her, and that no man loves work, but I love what's in the work, a sense of who I am. So work can save us. Efficiency can save us. According to some, if we can read the text that way, right? That just get down and do our jobs, and I, Marlowe, will not become a Kurtz. But there's a problem here, and this is the final slide. Efficiency can also lead to genocide. In this sense, I would argue that Kurtz is a bit of a red herring. It's really not about Kurtz. It's about ordinary people. That genocides depend upon ordinary people. That the Nazi genocide, the Holocaust, needed its butchers, its bakers, its candlestick makers, and its train engineers. It needed the trains to run on time. It needed to be efficient. And ordinary people needed to perform perfectly ordinary functions. It was just an industrial problem to be resolved by industrial means, just as the Grove of Death scene in this text, which we do not have time to read right now. I think one of the most powerful things you'll ever read in the Western literary tradition is when Marlowe descends into the Grove of Death and sees people dying and recognizes immediately that this is genocidal, and recognizes his own complicity in this, and realizes that something like this isn't really just one person saying, let's kill all these people. It's the byproduct of ordinary people doing ordinary things. Call them, if you will, genocidal nerds, just going about their job. And when the dust settles and the war is over and the tribunals begin and the Nuremberg trials begin, nobody ever really did anything except their job. Well, I was just doing what I was told to, just ordinary people doing ordinary things. It's those ordinary people, like Marlowe, who are carrying the genocide into the heart of darkness. And I think he recognizes that on one level. We're told, are we not, that all Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. This is another way of saying, I think, that we all played our part. That we can stand back and say, oh, this is bad. But if we're not careful, yes, on the one hand, efficiency can save us. On the other hand, it can also, if we're not careful, it can lead to genocide. It can lead to lies like the Congo Free State, a notorious lie. Arbeit macht frei. Work makes us free, a notorious lie. That's what it said above the gates at Auschwitz. Read this passage, The Grove of Death, on your own, and see if you don't agree with me that it's a very powerful and stirring, emotional description of a genocide that is prefiguring other genocides yet to come, many more, unfortunately, yet to come. And I think there's something unprecedented in this. There's something very modern in this, that in just doing our jobs, we are actually helping to enact something very terrible. Finally, remember that we're told in this text that there are no external checks out there, right? That there's no government to hold us all in awe, to quote Hobbes. That we're out there, and if we're going to yield to the darkness the way Kurtz does, nothing's going to stop it from happening. So are they going to be like Marlowe? We're going to be like Kurtz, or if we're lucky, we'll be like the papier-mâché Mephistopheles, or we'll be like the hairdresser's dummy. There's nothing going on inside us, so we're not going to yield to the forces of darkness. But we are just doing our jobs, and we don't escape it that way either. Anyway, I'm sorry, I've gone further than I should. One last slide. This, to me, sums up the text. The essentials of this affair lay deep under the surface, beyond my reach and beyond my power of meddling. This is, in some ways, I think, Marlowe's final verdict on Kurtz, who he is yet to meet when he says this. This affair, I think, means life. So read this affair as life. The essentials of life lay deep under the surface, beyond my reach and beyond my power of meddling. I'm very sorry, Derek, I've eaten up so much of your time. Let's break, and let's make an effort to be back at 1:10 so that we can complete the lecture. Thank you very much.